And then there were 12, 9 Labour, 3 Conservatives, with constant rumours now of more to come. Is this a splinter or is it a split? And if it is a split, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Let's deal with the ontology of the 12. Essentially, the left wing of the Conservative Party and the right wing of the Labour Party are beginning to coalesce together. They say that they are not the Liberal Democrats because they say the Liberal Democrat brand has been irrevocably soiled by the coalition government of the Lib Dems and David Cameron. That's odd because they themselves have now pledged that they will not vote in a vote of no confidence in the government to bring the Theresa May government down. So they are now effectively in a coalition arrangement with the Conservative Party. And moreover, although they are, well, to put it mildly, almost all of them Euromaniacs, absolute devotees of Brussels and the European Union, they may well be the reason why Theresa May's Brexit deal might get through Parliament, for fear, of course, of something worse. But nonetheless, it would be one of the great ironies of this situation that Theresa May might actually be able to deliver Brexit thanks to the votes of people who think the sun shines out of the Brussels posterior. The Tony Blair wing of the Labour Party has been, as you just heard Chris Williamson say on the news, acting as a fifth column within the Labour Party from the day and hour that Jeremy Corbyn was elected as the leader. He put them all, very unwisely in my view, in his shadow cabinet, and they then all resigned on an hourly basis as part of the coup against Corbyn. They sought to break him as a man, to quote someone who was present at the Parliamentary Labour Party when they almost literally crucified JC. They decided that such were their differences to Jeremy Corbyn that they would have to force a new leadership election. And where's Wally? What's his name? Wally Smith from South Wales put up against him as the candidate and was roundly thrashed. They then stayed off the front bench. They refused to participate in Labour Party politics, but remained behind him with their knives in their hands. If it had not been for that period, I firmly believe that Jeremy Corbyn would already be in 10 Downing Street. As it was, despite that period of utter destabilisation, of wrecking and sabotaging everything that the Labour front bench tried to do, despite all of that, Corbyn scored the best electoral result since 1945. He totally transformed the Labour political landscape. He made it the biggest party in Britain. In fact, bigger than all the other parties in Britain put together. He made it the biggest Labour party anywhere in the whole world. He made it the biggest political party in Europe. And he scored the best result since Clement Attlee in the Labour landslide in 1945. It seems to me a fair shout, therefore, that if he hadn't had to deal with the fifth column in his own ranks, he might very well have won that general election. But here's the second paradox of the evening. Every single one, bar one, actually, Ian Austin, whose face I just look at now on the screen, forcing myself to do so, Ian Austin won his seat by 22 votes. This despite the fact that all across Britain the Labour vote was multiplying. And every single one of these defectors, bar Austin, multiplied their majority, some of them scoring some of the biggest Labour votes ever recorded. And they did so with Corbyn as their leader and on a manifesto written by Corbyn. they told their electors that if they voted for them, they could have a Labour government instead of Theresa May. And tens, scores, hundreds of thousands of voters believed them and elected them to Parliament, only to discover that, hey, presto, they don't have a Labour MP at all. And so the first point I'm making tonight, it is a democratic outrage that people can systematically pretend to be one thing to the electorate at a general election and then reveal their true selves after the election, but without stepping down and allowing their voters to pass judgment on their judgment. And there ought to be a law against it. And if Jeremy Corbyn does get into government, I hope and I believe that he will introduce such a law. Secondly, the Conservative defectors are, well, let's say, they're not of the first rank. In fact, if you look at this picture as a whole, and I was there in the early 1980s when the Gang of Four broke away from the Labour Party, these were political giants compared to the 12 we're talking about today. These were four people who'd all been cabinet ministers for many years, when cabinet ministers were cabinet ministers, when they were all potential prime ministers, when everybody in the land recognised their gravitas, their weight in political affairs. All of them had left a sizable footprint in the sands of political time. And they failed in their breakaway. The question is whether a much lesser order of men and women of the new centre grouping can do better. And that brings me to my third paradox. The new independent group, or TIG as Dan Wootton calls them, TIG are not a political party. In fact, today Choka Amuna said, we are not a political party and we are leaderless, because we want the best man or woman for the job, and that person might not have joined us yet. Makes you wonder who they have in mind. Let me tell you who I think they have in mind. Behind the curtain of all of this is the malignant presence of Tony Blair. It's his brains, it's his money, and he is calling the shots. And if there is no leader yet, it's because he hasn't yet decided whether it's a good thing or a bad thing for him to become the leader. None of this is hindsight. I have been saying this to you and on platforms across all of the last 3 years, certainly of the last 2, since the referendum on leaving the European Union. The game is that Tony Blair comes to the rescue of big capital, big business, big finance, big media, big civil service, big deep state. He comes to the rescue and wrecks Brexit. Which leads me on to a new breaking story. That new breaking story from the mouth of John McDonnell, whom I have known for a very long time. I knew him so long ago. He was a Trotskyite then. I knew him and know a very great deal about John McDonnell. And I know that all of his life he hated the European Union and all of its works. But he says today that Labour is moving towards having a second referendum. And I give him this warning, and I give Labour this warning, that if Labour betrays the voters in the Brexit referendum and the Labour voters who voted for their manifesto in 2017, which promised to respect the result of the 2016 referendum, if they break that promise, they will break the Labour Party. They will break millions of Labour voters away from their party. And they will propel Nigel Farage and his Brexit party to undreamt of levels of political support. Don't do it, Germany. I know that John McDonnell's trying to bounce you into this. I know that John McDonnell is on permanent manoeuvres. I know everything about everything that he does. Don't fall for it, Jeremy. Don't be bounced into doing the independent group's bidding, following this parade of political dwarves into your own party's oblivion. Don't do it, Jeremy. Now, what else is on the agenda? Shamima Begum. No, before I turn to that, let me say something about myself. It's been quite a week, as Dan Wootton observed. Apparently I've been popping up on Sky News all throughout his show, I presume from my interview from Liverpool earlier in the week. Now, I have not and will not now and not ever, apply to rejoin the Labour Party. Not now, not ever. I have written to the Labour Party's General Secretary, Jenny Formby, and asked her to set aside, to rescind my expulsion from the Labour Party in 2003, on the grounds that that expulsion was predetermined, unjust, unlawful, contrary to rule, and now looks utterly ridiculous. It looks utterly ridiculous to expel someone from a party for standing up to Tony Blair's Iraq war when no one can be found to defend Tony Blair's Iraq war anywhere in this land or any other. History has absolved me for my stand on the Iraq war. And by definition, conversely, history has condemned already my expulsion from the Labour Party. And so it's time for justice to be done. And I have a QC's opinion in my inside pocket. I mean literally in my inside pocket right now as I speak to you, which demonstrates beyond any possible contradiction that my expulsion was unlawful, contrary to rule, and could not stand in a court of law. So, the Labour Party should do the right thing. Posterity, if it's not too grand a claim, history requires it. The history of the Labour Party certainly requires it. I'm a part of that history, and I require it too. But that's not the same thing as applying to join the Labour Party. I will never, ever apply to join a party that should never have expelled me in the first place. Justice requires the General Secretary to act on that. I've only got a minute, so let me say something about Shamima Begum. I spoke about it last week, quite briefly, but since I spoke, what we feared most has occurred. I believe that every single British person that aided and abetted ISIS in Iraq and Syria or anywhere else in the world should be on trial in front of a British court, and if convicted, should be behind bars in a British prison. I believe that ISIS are Satan walking on the earth. I have no sympathy for, nor any wish to give support to anyone who went there to aid and abet this excrescence that has massacred hundreds of thousands of people in Syria, Iraq, and around the world. But I cannot support taking the citizenship away from this young woman, still less from her newborn son. She should be in jail in Britain, not festering in a camp in Syria. And the Home Secretary's decision to claim that Shamima Begum is not a British citizen because she's entitled to be a citizen of Bangladesh would be laughable if it were not so tragic. After all, where does that finish? Who else in Britain, in theory, could be a citizen of another country? Are they all to be exposed to the danger of having their British citizenship stripped from them? Just think about that for a moment. I don't want to go into too much detail. Might make some people twitch nervously in their chairs if I did. But if we are in the situation where anybody who theoretically could be deemed to be a citizen of another country, whether that other country agreed with it or not, we are into 1984, we're into Orwell's world, and I will never go quietly into that kind of world.
Now it's up to you to let the debate begin. If you think George Galloway...
Now, get your calls in, please, early, because it's going to be very busy tonight. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. We take your number and we call you back when it's time to put you on the radio, so it won't cost you more than a penny or two. You can also email me via the website at talkradio.co.uk. You can text me, text the word talk, followed by your message to 87222, though that will cost you 25 pence plus normal sending charges. You can tweet me for free at George Galloway at Talk Radio, and we'll try and get through as many of those messages and calls as we can. I'm glad, though, that we're joined by the master, by the doyen of psephologists, of political scientists. Professor Sir John Curtice is on the line. Sir John, thank you very much indeed.
Not at all. You're welcome, George.
Now, let's start with the 12. Is this the last of them, do you think? Or is there a bigger group waiting in the wings? And I'm thinking of the Tories as well as Labour. In a way, there's nobody surprising in the Labour breakaways, but it might be that there are some surprising Tories also waiting to enter the independent stage.
Well, I think the answer to that question probably now rests on how the Brexit process plays out. It is no secret that it's going to be very difficult indeed for the Prime Minister to keep her party together, indeed to keep her government together, if she finds herself heading for no deal. But if she does find herself heading for no deal, it's pretty clear that there are at least one or two further Conservative MPs for whom that might be a sufficient impetus for them to pull out of the Conservative Party. On the Labour side, almost undoubtedly, the debate, the future now, at least people being attracted to the independent group, depends on whether or not the party is seen to be at least being warmer to the idea of a second vote than it has been so far, because for the most part, those who are going to join the independent group are those who, yes, have other reasons as to why they're unhappy with Jeremy Corbyn, not least anti-Semitism and their feeling about the culture of the party, but it is also that they are those who are opposed to Brexit. That does probably therefore mean that a couple of the votes that are due to take place next week, or expected to take place next week, could be vital. Now, this all assumes, by the way, that Theresa May doesn't come back on Tuesday with a deal with the European Union, and she puts that to Parliament next week, which is there's some speculation she might do. But let's assume that doesn't happen for the time being. There are probably two crucial amendments. One is the amendment that Peter Carr's put forward that essentially says we will allow the deal to go through so long as the government then holds a second EU referendum, which frankly I think is the suggestion the House of Lords would always have tried to insist on anyway. And whether or not the Labour Party backs that proposal, if indeed it goes to a vote, I think there is a feeling amongst some of those who are in favour of an EU referendum that failure to back that amendment would be inconsistent with the Labour Party conference motion. The other, probably even more crucial amendment, however, is what we've now come to know as the Cooper-Bowles or the Cooper-Lightman amendment, which is the idea that the House of Commons should give Theresa May a deadline of around March the 13th And if she doesn't manage to meet that deadline and get a deal through, then she will be required to accept legislation that will say we are not leaving without a deal, and you have to ask an extension of Article 50. In truth, there might be reason as to why both Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn might be happy if that amendment to go through. Certainly, I think Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party can be expected to be whipped in favour, but there's no guarantee it will go through. But the advantage to both for Theresa May is that it means that the threat of no deal is taken off the table, and arguably it is the threat of no deal which is now potentially the greatest risk to the continuity of her government. Although that said, if it goes through, it will probably mean there's been substantial rebellion in her own party for it to go through. Equally for Jeremy Corbyn, if indeed it looks as though the extension of Article 50 is in play, the pressure on him to go towards a second EU referendum is dropped. So there is a kind of perhaps rather peculiar common interest in what will be a backbench rebellion going through, because the backbench rebellion may help to relieve both party leaders of some of the weight that is potentially dragging them down.
Sir John, if the Article 50 is delayed, does that mean, how long does it have to be delayed to force us to participate in the European Parliament elections, in which situation Nigel Farage's new Brexit party will enter the battlefield?
The common answer to that question is probably no later than the end of June, beginning of July, i.e. we shouldn't be remaining in the EU beyond the point at which the new European Parliament is due to convene. Well, I think the honest truth is, George, although no Tory minister is willing to admit it, I think an extension to Article 50 of some kind is now virtually inevitable, because I frankly think it's going to be very difficult indeed. Even if Theresa May comes back next week and manages narrowly to get a deal through the House of Commons, she has to get legislation through the House of Commons and the House of Lords. That legislation is potentially amendable, and whether or not she will have a control over the timetable, very debatable. So getting things through now by March the 29th, as Angela Leadsom has frankly hinted, if not been clear on, it does now look rather a big ask, and therefore this is going to be some kind of extension. But so certainly for some people, avoiding the European Union parliamentary elections just seems quite important. But of course, it will then depend on what the purpose of the extension is. If the purpose of the extension is either because Mrs May's government has reached the end of the road and we're precipitated an early general election, or indeed the Peter Kyle Amendment goes through and we find ourselves heading towards some kind of referendum before Parliament can ratify Mrs May's deal, we're going to need a relatively lengthy extension, and maybe that is going to require us to take part in European Parliament elections, which certainly the EU would prefer not to have. That said, above all, I think we have to remember, for the European Union, victory in these negotiations is for the UK to change its mind. Second prize is for us to go for a softer Brexit than Theresa May has in mind. So if by extension it makes either of those two possibilities more likely, I think we can expect the European Union to take the chance, inconvenient though it may be. But frankly, us changing our minds in the long run is jolly less inconvenient for the European Union than is us leaving.
Do you agree with me that if we do participate in the European Parliament elections, that Nigel Farage has a very real chance of winning them?
Well, winning as in the sense of, getting more votes than anybody else, but remember, it's a proportional representation election. Presumably, I mean that is going to be rest on the presumption that he can basically pick up the embers of UKIP that are worth picking up, and the rest of it collapses. But have to remember, he's basically having to start a new party from afresh in a very, very short period of time. And I think much will also depend on the circumstances in which that's happening. I think certainly, it is a reasonable assumption that if indeed we are delaying Article 50 because Mrs May hasn't got her deal through, that many a Leave voter who we know switched to the Conservatives in 2017 because they thought that was the best way of getting the deal delivered. And we've seen already in the wake of Chequers, in the wake of the original publication of the deal, showing some inclination to go back to the Conservatives, that in those circumstances, I think you're probably quite right, that many of them would express their view about the way in which the Brexit process has gone by voting for a Brexit party, certainly if Nigel Farage is leading it, and that is undoubtedly going to hurt the Conservatives much more than the Labour Party. On the Labour side, well, again, we're having to make a guess as to what state the Labour Party is in at that point. The Labour Party is clearly, shall we put it like this, something of a fragile creature at the moment. And, we are now seeing MPs leaving the party, even though they don't necessarily agree with the independent group about Brexit. And the question is whether or not this trickle becomes more of a flood in the course of the next few weeks. If that happens, then, of course, the European Parliament elections could be very interesting indeed.
I suppose that's the big question, Sir John, that is it a splinter or is it a split? It's my view that the right wing of the Labour Party and the left wing of the Conservative Party have far more in common than they do apart. And so I suppose I'm asking, is this remaking the mould or breaking the mould, as we used to say during the SDP breakaway in the 80s?
Well, I think remaking the mould is probably the better phrase, because we have to bear in mind at the end of the day, insofar as we're able to characterise the independent group at the moment, it's essentially A, relatively centrist on economic issues, but B, socially liberal and pro-Remain. Well, we already have a party that fits that description. It's called the Liberal Democrats. And I think it's already clear, certainly on the Liberal Democrat side, that they are anticipating that we might see a not dissimilar process to the process that happened in the wake of the formation of the SDP in 1981. That is that there will be an accommodation reached between the Liberal Democrats and this new grouping, which may mean some kind of electoral pact and maybe eventually leads to some form of coming together. So
the alliance. They might call it the alliance, John.
One somehow suspects that for all sorts of reasons they won't call it the alliance. And I suspect equally, however, I suspect Vince Cable will not be unsympathetic to the idea of no longer calling themselves Liberal Democrats, because he's aware of the way in which that brand got tarnished as a result of the coalition. But, I think, in part here, rather than talking about, as it were, a new British politics, we may simply be talking about how a socially liberal centre that, despite the fact that the Labour Party wasn't embracing the Remain side, the Liberal Democrats weren't able to capture in 2017, haven't been able to do so since, but maybe with the impetus of this new group, maybe we do end up with a revived social liberal centre. I think one should still remember, George, you will understand as much as anybody, the extent to which political parties are tribal, and they're also, in the end, they're social organisations. People know each other and they kind of like each other. Now, in part, yes, Anna Soubry and Chukwuemeka have been able to come together because they've got to know each other, they've got to like each other because they've been working together on Brexit. But still, they will discover that, the Liberal Democrats have their own distinctive culture, which is different from the culture of the Conservative Party, which is different from the culture of the Labour Party. And the question is whether those cultures can be married. These things are not easy. There's an awful lot of friction between the SDP and the Liberal Democrats and the Liberal Party before, in the end, effectively, the SDP collapsed and thereby enabled the Liberal Party to take them over.
Quite so. Lastly, and I'm grateful for your time, the independent group are sitting as a private company rather than a party. Neither of us have ever seen such a thing before. Doesn't seem to me tenable, that, because it's a transparent attempt to avoid transparency, isn't it?
Well, it's certainly true that it won't be sustainable in the long run. It certainly means that they're not in a position to run any candidates in any kind of election because they have to register as a political party to do that. It may well be, George, that we're in the same phase the SDP was in between the Limehouse Declaration and the creation of the SDP some 2 or 3 months later. This has obviously happened somewhat more quickly than was originally anticipated. The planning for this has been going on for a long time. And Stephen Bush, the New Statesman, broke the story that there was going to be a split in the Labour Party back in the summer of last year. It's now happened somewhat more quickly than we anticipated, and maybe a little bit more quickly than they anticipated. But certainly one would anticipate anticipate that they are going to have to apply and want to apply for registration with the Electoral Commission relatively soon. The other thing, by the way, that they are also going to sort out very quickly, another reason why they will need to talk to Liberal Democrats, if there are, let us say that there's another dozen or slightly more than a dozen MPs, either Conservative or Labour, that do join this group, and that therefore, as a result, this group, together with the Liberal Democrats, have more than 35 MPs, and that therefore, if they were to form a common parliamentary group, will be able to take away from the SNP the privilege of being the third party inside the House of Commons. That will be quite substantial incentive in terms of the media coverage, the prominence of this organisation, and the standing it has inside the House of Commons. So that will be another.
I don't think they've not got much to worry about in media coverage, John. I don't think. Thank you for taking me down that memory lane of the alliance, the breakaway of the early 1980s. I remember it only too well. Professor Sir John Curtice. I told you he was an expert.
Now it's up to you to let the debate begin. If you think George Galloway is played...
0344 499 1000. Better get your calls in quickly. Norman on the Twitter says, as I came to age during the SDP split, can I seem to remember the Falklands War had as much, if not more, impact than the SDP split. This time Brexit will have more impact than TIG. Splitters aren't very good at politics, are they? Thanks, Norman. And Ahmed says, the problem with Corbyn is that he was fighting the party and he thought he was winning because the party didn't fight back. After decades of disloyalty, the last thing Corbyn could ask for is loyalty. Thank you, Ahmed. And Andrew says the MPs who've left Labour and Conservative parties this week are national heroes for resigning from these doomed parties, intent on leading the UK economy into a no-deal Brexit shambles. I've always voted Labour, but cannot support a party that has been taken over by bullies and is supporting this Brexit madness. Destroy the UK. Whatever happened to the People Party of Tolerance? And Ray says the fifth column have been outed and rejected. If they truly believe in their new party, they would put their spines where their mouths are and trigger by-elections. We are stronger without them. And Scouser Lar in Liverpool says, I'm absolutely delighted that the Labour fifth column have finally gone off to form their own Tory tribute act. Labour is slowly becoming real Labour again. However, any MP resigning from any party should be forced to face a by-election. Let's take the first call. It's from North Somerset. Martin, the floor is yours. Hi.
Hi, George. Thanks for taking my call. Now, I just really just got to know your programme by listening to you when you were talking about the idea, the ludicrous idea of a second referendum before we've enacted the first one.
Yes, quite.
You know,
it's a novel constitutional principle.
It's a nonsense, isn't it? And what happens if it goes the way then? What do you say? We'll make it the best of five?
Best of three, best of five.
Whichever way it goes, you know, it can run and run.
Yeah.
No, but I'm just annoyed about the hypocrisy of these levers, these splitters, you know, from the two parties. They stood on a manifesto. They voted in that. You know, they voted. The Parliament voted Article 50. They stood on a manifesto to enact the will of the people.
Both parties did, Martin.
Yeah, both parties. Exactly. That's right. That's what I mean. You know, And suddenly now, and what makes me laugh is that their mantra was always, you know, it's better to stay in the European Union and reform it from within. Yeah, but as soon as it comes down to their own sort of their own ideas about their own party, they're not prepared to do that. You know.
Good point. And then there's the people's vote idea. We should have a people's vote on reversing the referendum, but no people's vote when it comes to re-electing the people who've changed their coat.
Exactly. These people should all stand immediately for re-election. Apart from anything else, it's going to cause a big problem because, you know, I have to say, you know, the leadership of the Labour Party is in a quandary now because they've been against the second referendum, but now they seem to be moving closer towards it.
Well, John McDonnell is. We haven't heard from Mr. Corbyn yet, but John McDonnell maybe jumped the gun, or maybe he's trying to bounce.
I hope not, because it's a betrayal of the people that voted, and I also think that they've been calling that they've always said what we want is a general election. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's fine, but now they've gone very quiet on that, haven't they?
Yes, although to be fair, you can't actually force that now because you've got this independent group that were once in the lobby for the no confidence motion, who are now not going to be. But don't you think, Martin, that they're playing fast and loose with people's faith in democracy in Britain?
Well,
they're running very big risks.
Absolutely. And it is. And people are going to get very angry. And my worry is that people will say, basically, sod it, what's the point in voting at all?
Well, that would be the passive thing to do. I'm more afraid of the active, and of course the far right. The far right. Look, if I were sitting here as a far right politician, I'd be praying that they betray the result of the referendum, because nothing would be more grist to my mill than being able to say that this democracy business is just the lipstick on the pig. As soon as they need to, they wipe the lipstick off.
Yeah, that's it exactly. And as soon as I knew this would happen, as soon as it came down to let's give Parliament the final decision.
Indeed.
I knew this would happen because
I wrote about it at the time. As soon as the Gina Miller case took place, we were always on this track. Martin, it's been nice talking to you. Let me go, though, to Richard in Manchester. Go ahead, Richard.
Good evening, George. Thank you for taking my call.
Welcome.
I disagree with one thing that you've said tonight so far. Mm-hmm. I think that Blair, the warmonger, has no chance whatsoever of becoming the leader of a party in England again. I think that David Miliband, this is my own personal opinion, I've been trying to figure it all out.
No, it's a good call, good shout.
And lead the people. Mm-hmm. And I think Soros is putting up all the money for this fight. These MPs leaving.
Well, we've got no evidence, of course, of that, but that's the problem. Because they're an independent company rather than a party, we're unable to see who put the money up. So it could be Soros, it could be Putin, it could be Hezbollah or Hamas. How can we tell?
George, Lord Adonis admitted taking the Soros money on TV last week or the week before.
Well, there's no doubt that Mr. Soros put millions into the campaign to wreck Brexit. That's true. But we've got no evidence yet that he's put any money into this independent group.
Well, someone on the radio the other day said that there has been an account opened in the Panama for this lot to feed off to.
I really don't think that's true. I was attracted to a piece of flumery that there was a Panama connection, but it turns out it's the website that is registered in Panama. The company, which is owned 75% or more by Gavin Shuker MP, the Luton Labour breakaway MP, he's the 75% or more owner of the company Gemini, and it's in Britain. It's a British company.
Oh, thanks for clearing that up.
Yeah.
Mr. Torres, if you're listening, I'm very, very sorry. But Blair said, with Andrew Neil, I am going to stop it. He was on television for 20 minutes, and I am going to stop it, George. I looked at Subri and I listened to her today in your opposite radio station, and her own electorate just tore into her today to call her a traitor. Chuka Amuna is a Blair clown, as I call it. Yvette Cooper, I've written to her and say, please don't go ahead with this, because she will never get elected in Yorkshire ever again. And I think a new referendum, if they do go ahead with it, George, it will result in a bigger win for Brexiteers. And if I had the money like Soros, I'd put it up and make sure that we get over the line, because I think that in 6 weeks' time, when it's all over, and this is my personal opinion, we will be heading for becoming one of the best countries again in the world. If the 17.4 million people all stand firm, and I think this is the last throw of the dice for Blair. He hasn't got enough time to do very much more, and I only hope he fails, as I hope he fails on everything that he ever does, because he is a liar. And everybody else says that and knows that. And that's why if David Miliband comes in, he's got Mr. Blair, number 2, to take over from him.
Very interesting call. Very interesting show. Strong words, Richard. Your words, not mine. Thanks very much indeed for the call. Jason, Lexit CPB Morning Star, says, just seen the opening of Channel 4 News. Austin's, quote, damning allegations. Venezuela's, quote, aid crisis. Dover fishermen regretting voting leave. This blatant, shameless propaganda is what passes for news on national television. Hashtag propaganda blitz. And Peter in Glasgow says, Mr. G, was it not a preference of David Cameron to have lipstick on the pig? I can't imagine what he means. But Peter is still on. If Mr. Corbyn doesn't pull his finger out soon, this country is in danger of slipping into the abyss. Jem Lexit Yellow Vests says it's shocking there isn't a law already. Of course any MP leaving a party to join any party group should face a by-election. It's a no-brainer. By-elections now. And Filza, my old friend in Ireland, says Sajid Javid is acting like an ostrich, burying its head in the sand by disowning Shamima Begum. She's British and Britain's responsibility. Bring her back to face the court. And Georgie says I should think that these TIG lot will forget pro-EU voters into fully fledged Brexiteers. Plus, we get rid of these rotten people. We need a new deputy leader contest now. Watson must go. And the Communicipalist says what the runaway MPs who have now privatised Parliament itself by making a private company a parliamentary bloc, who've never been elected for whatever it is they stand for, this remains a secret like TIG funding. This is a sinister development, I think. I think it's extraordinarily sinister. And what's more sinister is that none of the media seem to give a toss about it. X-Ray Vision says, forget the usual brown-tongue corporate media propaganda dressed up as the news. It's Friday. It's talk radio. It's George Galloway. It's the mother of all talk shows. Thank you. John says, if British government supports unelected president for American illegal regime change in Venezuela, then anything is possible. Even war criminal Blair as the new party figurehead. And an SMS from John in Cheshire says Corbyn has to get the constituencies to deselect the malcontents as soon as possible. If he compromises, inevitably they will ambush him on some other issues. They weren't elected because of their radiant personality or intellect. It was because they were representing Labour. Most of them are not household names in their own house, and they'll soon be forgotten. Well, I agree entirely with that, John. It may be that it's too late. All week we have seen Labour MPs openly threatening to desert the Labour Party unless Corbyn does this or doesn't do that. It's in danger of becoming a rabble rather than a party. Hassan Diwan says lots of countries have citizenship on offer for payment. All of our citizenships are on the chopping block. And York's Lass says, if Ian Austin MP is being truthful that Jeremy Corbyn is a threat to national security if he becomes Prime Minister, why has MI5, MI6, etc. given Jeremy Corbyn full clearance to be on the Privy Council along with Theresa May? Well, that's a very powerful point. If everything that Ian Austin said about Jeremy Corbyn is true, then Corbyn should be under arrest. Maybe that's what they actually want. The Red Resistance says, what an absolute state British politics is in. The Tories having their strings pulled by Lord Snooty, Labour eating itself, TIG, a weird coalition of Blairites and pro-austerity Tories. If Farage picks his team and policies carefully, he really could clean up. Do you know what? I think you are right. We have a situation now where none of the parties are fit for purpose.
Now it's up to you to let the debate begin. If you think George Galloway... Radio.
We're talking the breakaway, we're talking the EU and the WTO, we're talking British politics and international politics, and quite soon we'll have the cleverest man of England in our midst. He is, of course, Adam Gary. If you've got a question for him, just hashtag it. Ask Adam. Christina says words evoke feelings. For example, the words moderate, liberal have connotations of being reasonable and fairness. However, if you examine the policies or voting record of some so-called moderates and liberals, they are rather right-wing. Indeed, it's actually, Christina, been one of the banes of my whole life that we were always called the militants, and those who actually supported the rapacious wars and exploitation were called the moderates. As the late and great best Prime Minister we never had, Tony Benn, used to say, why is it always pitched that the workers are demanding £4.50 an hour and the employers are offering £2.50? Why isn't it reversed? Why does it not say the workers are offering to work for another £4.50 an hour, while the employers are demanding that they work for just £2.50? Here's Regan in Newcastle upon Tyne. Regan, welcome.
Hello, George. You okay?
Yeah, good. Nice to hear you.
Yeah, it's very nice to hear you too. I'll keep it brief because I know you've got a lot of calls on. But I've got a question which I really don't know if I know the answer to, and I think you might.
Okay.
The breakaway MPs, specifically the Labour side, have now declared themselves a private company.
9 of them, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I find it quite chilling that a private company can be involved in Parliament. That's like
exactly. I mean, because apart from anything else, Regan, they could be doing anything in that private company. They could be BAE Limited. They could be involved in any kind of trafficking or trading.
Yeah, it could be Amazon. Could now be sitting in Parliament.
Could now have a group of 9 MPs. Yeah.
But obviously. We don't know who funds them at all, but no. I mean, it points largely. Tony Blair, it was revealed, possibly could be funding a party like this. Now, if it was Tony Blair, and it's revealed in the fullness of time, even after an election, which would be diabolical. But I mean, surely, if he is revealed to be funding a breakaway party, would it not be mandatory for him to be expelled from the Labour Party? He can't possibly.
Yes. You might well wonder how he can possibly still be in the Labour Party when he is day and daily trying to destroy the Labour Party's prospects. He's in the Labour Party and I'm still out of it. You couldn't make it up.
I do think it's disgraceful. I mean, I think if he was to be expelled in a motion by Corbyn or someone at the top, probably you would see most of the MPs go, though, which would destroy the party. But my final point, George, is over this last week, obviously, I know you've declared that you have applied to be readmitted to the Labour Party, and the general, I've been like the Guardian comment section, and people going, oh, God, the last straw, Galloway's coming back. I honestly can't point to what you've done that is so bad that people would say, oh, you can't readmit him. I really don't, So I say I hope you get readmitted. And
well, look, it's very kind of you. It's very kind of you to say so, Regan. I'm afraid your experience tells you more about The Guardian than it does about me or you. I would be shocked if the response in The Guardian comment section was anything other than that. I have no need at all to be in the Labour Party, and I have no need at all to be in Parliament. But when I look around at the job that's being done by those around Jeremy Corbyn, I know that I could do a better one. And because I believe that Britain needs a new government of the Jeremy Corbyn type, that's the only reason that I have now written to the General Secretary demanding that now is the time, now that these rats are abandoning the ship, I think now is the time to act. We'll see if she agrees. Thanks for the call. Steve is in Fife in Scotland. Go ahead, Steve.
Hi, George. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Nice to hear your voice.
Brilliant. Great to listen to your show, George.
Thanks.
I wanted just to, I'm sure you'll be familiar with this quote, George, from a guy called Jean Monnet, who was one of the financial founding fathers.
He's one of the founders of the EU, yeah.
Yeah. And there is a brilliant quote, and you're probably aware of it, but maybe a lot of your listeners aren't aware of it, George. And I think it's just well worth just quoting it and let the words sink in.
Mm-hmm.
Europe's nations should be guided towards the superstate without their people understanding what is happening. This can be accomplished by successive steps, each disguised as having an economic purpose, but which will eventually and irreversibly lead to federation. I think that quote speaks.
It's quite chilling, yeah. It's quite chilling both in its supranational ambition, but also in the subterfuge that it's predicated upon.
Exactly.
By small steps, deceive the people.
Exactly.
It's the antithesis of democracy. If Mr. Ben were alive, he would more eloquently put it than I just did. The reason, it's not because I love states, Steve.
Yeah.
States are here today, gone tomorrow. Czechoslovakia no longer exists. Austro-Hungary no longer exists. Scotland, if Bonnie Prince Charlie had won, would be a part of France from 1715 until now. I have nothing about states, and you know what colour my flag is.
Absolutely.
And it's not any of these national flags. What I care about is not states, but democracy. Because without democracy, we cannot control our lives. And for the moment, nation states are the only units of a sufficiently small but sufficiently large size that a majority or a plurality of people can guide their own future, can shape their own future in a world that's owned by corporations and companies, transnationals and the rest. That's the reason why I'm against the European Union. If I thought the European Union could be a United States of Europe that was democratic and would act in the interests of the people, I'd be in favour of it. But it's the opposite. It's the opposite of that.
What's behind that statement, and it's who's behind it, George, because there is definitely an agenda, and I think that more and more people are awakening up to that, hence the 52%.
Yeah.
But I do believe that if people were being exposed to that quote, just that goes...
It's a great quote. I'm glad. I'm going to play it back and write it down. I'll be using it myself. Of course, I've heard it before, but as you described it or delivered it, it was chilling in the extreme. Thanks, Steve, for that call from Fife. It's all going on.
Now it's up to you to let the debate begin. If you think George Galloway is radio.
0344 499 1000. That's the number to call about any of the subjects we are discussing tonight. I'm joined by the cleverest man in England, Adam Gary. Belated happy birthday to you, Adam.
Thank you, George.
You're 32 going on 62 because your wisdom sits uneasily on a 32-year-old shoulder. You're the smartest 32-year-old I've ever met since I was 32 when I entered Parliament at exactly your age. That. And Parliament is the place you should be. I'm absolutely persuaded of that. The questions for you are flooding in. I'm going to go straight to them. Tony X, who's no mean brain himself, says, ask Adam, Venezuela failed experiment or victim of external aggression?
Well, right now it's the external aggressors who are doing the experiment. Venezuela's had an economic crisis that has many factors, all of which could have been foreseen. A declining oil price leading to a Dutch crisis, a Dutch disease they call it, whereby any economy that's based on the export of one commodity, when that commodity price falls, you're clearly in trouble. Nothing unique to Venezuela, nothing unique to left-wing or right-wing economic theories. There were also crises of management, again, nothing to do with an ideological experiment. I can name you 10 countries with different political systems and different leaders who have various managerial crises.
Well, we're one of them. You know, today is the first time since 1978 that Britain has had an actual minority government, even with the supply arrangement with the Democratic Unionist Party. The Tories no longer have a majority in Parliament.
Well, this is the biggest story that's being ignored from every quarter, is that where Theresa May was elected with a plurality in 2017 and could only achieve a majority by coalescing with the DUP, now even with the DUP, she is in a minority. And depending on how the chips fall on the opposite side of the House to that of the government, she could be in trouble. Although in the short term, I suspect it's people on the Labour front bench who might be panicking first. But what goes around may well come around.
Now, going back to Venezuela and Tony's question, corruption is not, of course, the sole prerogative of left-wing countries, but there's even less justification for it in a left-wing country. If you say you're a revolution, the Venezuelan revolution, it is a contradiction in terms that you can have private corruption, sometimes on a very large scale, in that country. Why is it that corruption, and crime for that matter, is present to the extent that it seems to be in Venezuela and previously was in Brazil, again a country with a left-wing government, was not allowed was not stopped from happening, and played a part, certainly in Brazil, played a part in the victory of the fascist Bolsonaro in the last elections?
Well, because there's a difference between a country with a formally socialist constitution and countries with a multi-party so-called liberal democratic constitution which happen to elect left-wing governments.
Quite.
In 1945, Britain wasn't a Soviet satellite state with a socialist constitution. It simply happened to elect a left-wing government. The British constitution remained the same. The established Anglican Church remained the same. The monarch on the throne in Buckingham Palace remained the same. That's not particularly socialist, so while Clement Attlee certainly was a man with socialist principles, it didn't change the constitutional framework of Britain. The same is true in Venezuela since 1999, in spite of the constitutional reforms that both Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro have made. They've changed the constitution, but they haven't changed it in that ironclad direction in order to make it a Cuba. Venezuela is not Cuba, and the reason that private sector corruption can exist, along with public sector corruption, which exists in every country on earth, is because of that constitutional arrangement.
I think that's a very important point you've made, and it goes to Tony's question. France is a more socialist country than Venezuela is. The only thing that's in public ownership in Venezuela is the oil industry. Every other part of the economy remains in private hands. So the proportion of the economy in the state hands is higher in France than it is in Venezuela. The rate of tax that rich people pay in Venezuela is lower than it was when Margaret Thatcher was in power in Britain.
Well, and that's just the point. But there's another point that actually stems on from that, and that's there are other things that are more extreme in France than in Venezuela. The level of police violence against unarmed demonstrators, the government's willingness to prohibit otherwise legal demonstrations. You can see the videos today all over the internet, all over international satellite TV. People in Venezuela on all sides of the political spectrum are marching, and thus far, touch wood and cross fingers, it's all been peaceful.
You'll see from my Sputnik show on RT on Sky 511 tomorrow, 20 people have had their eyes shot out in France, not in Venezuela, in France, 30 miles away, nearer than Kent, far nearer than Scotland. But nobody in the British media is covering it. 30 eyes have been shot out. 2 hands have been blown off, severed from the body. And nobody knows about it. Anyway, look, one of the things I wanted to talk to you while we wait for more Ask Adam questions is you're a man of the East. You're an expert in the East. You run Eurasia Futures. You know about the economic and political comings and goings in the East. Isn't it true that Britain should be looking east as we leave a fading, failing European Union experiment?
Absolutely right. And of course, there's more than one country in the East. Some of them even have very divergent styles of economy and very different statuses of their economy. I gave you the classic but extremely relevant example today of China and Japan. Many people, especially on the Remain side in Britain, are freaking out because a lot of Japanese companies, Panasonic, Honda and others, are vacating Britain. Not surprising perhaps, because Japan and the EU have at long lost, after over a decade of negotiations, got their free trade agreement, the FTA. But here's the problem. When you have countries that are on the verge of recession, in some cases in recession, and certainly are stagnating, when living standards are accelerating at a rate in terms of their cost that far out eclipses people's savings and people's wages, you shouldn't pin your hopes on signing FTAs with countries in a similar position. In that
Which
sense,
Japan is.
Japan and the EU are peas in the same pod in that sense. China is a completely different story. China is a country that even in a bad year grew faster than any EU country and faster than the EU itself, faster than the United States. It's a country that is innovating in all of the sectors that are going to change the world in the 21st century. In that sense, in the same way American products tended to change the 20th century for consumers, for businesses, for doctors, and in the same way that was true of the 19th century in respect of Britain, China is doing that in the 21st century. And they're also a huge consumer market, one that in dollar for dollar terms is predicted to eclipse that of America's this year. Anyone who's making anything, especially high quality goods, which what few goods Britain makes, they pride themselves on high quality, should want to get into the Chinese market. The money would be flooding into a country like Britain, and likewise Chinese technology could make the lives of British people better, not just in terms of convenience, but in terms of many more substantial issues.
All the more extraordinary then that our Defence Secretary, don't tell him your name, Pike, gratuitously threatened and insulted China to the extent that China has now postponed any talks about an agreement with them.
Well, it would be like a person trying to start his first business, going into the bank and telling the bank officer, well, you certainly look a bit ugly. I don't know why your wife married you. It's really that childish and that foolish to be threatening the People's Liberation Army with a navy whose aircraft carrier cannot actually take landing aircraft. But be that as it may, China is a country that hasn't been at war with anyone since 1979. Which is a bit more than I can say for France, for Britain, certainly for the United States. China's a country that wants to trade its way into peace through prosperity, and it's frankly a model that I think Brexit Britain ought to adopt as soon as possible.
Now, the sun rises in the east, literally, but the economic sun is also still rising in the east as its quite clearly setting in the European Union. These obvious truths appear to not be present in this debate at all. For example, I was thinking while you were talking there, if the Japanese are threatening to close factories in England because of Brexit, why don't we ask the Chinese to take over the factories?
That's exactly what logic would dictate. China's in a unique position in that it's the world's #1 recipient of foreign direct investment, but it's also a country that through many private and public apparati within the country is investing all over the world. And one of the things that people tend to focus on, and for good reason, about Chinese investment is that it's about injecting cash, expertise, and hands-on infrastructural development into the developing world, into emerging markets. But there's also another part of that chapter, and the page doesn't get turned over enough, and that's that China's cash, China's expertise, Chinese tech know-how, Chinese patents, Chinese money can actually help otherwise stagnating and contracting economies to enter a new age. Hello, Britain. This is China. That's the way to do Brexit right. And not just China, but ASEAN, Pakistan, whose China-Pakistan economic corridor is linking the wider Afro-Eurasian space to the Pacific. The same could apply to Pakistan's rival India, and the list goes on and on. Ethiopia, one of the fastest growing economies in the world that no one's talking about, now at peace with its neighbor Eritrea, largely thanks to the incentive of Belt and Road connectivity coming out of China. If Britain really wants to go into the world and out of Europe, as the Leave campaign in 1975 suggested, the sun is absolutely rising in terms of cash, in terms of job creation, in terms of bettering life in the great Eastern economies, of which China is, of course, the biggest.
I hope you'll stay with us because there's a lot of Ask Adam coming in.
Absolutely.
But I need to take a break very shortly for the news. 0344 499 1000 is the number to call. You can email me, you can text me, or you can tweet me at George Galloway at Talk Radio.
Now it's up to you to let the debate begin. If you think George Galloway...
Yeah, just to comply with the law, I should read out the first piece of anonymous hate. It's a text. It says, George Galloway, you are an idiot. For once in your life, stop being a virtue-signalling rageaholic. Listen to an expert and admit you are wrong about Brexit. I'll just remind the anonymous texter of my phone number, 0344 499 1000. That's the number if you'd like to call me. Dan says, ask Adam, since Parliament is supposed to serve the people on behalf of the monarch, isn't it right that the Queen should dissolve Parliament if it is seen not to be doing the will of the people? Is there any precedent?
Not in contemporary terms. In contemporary terms, Parliament can be dissolved in several ways. One, the Prime Minister herself, or in some cases himself, can call for the dissolution of Parliament. It used to be something instantaneous. Now, because of a stupid and anti-democratic, in my opinion, piece of legislation from the previous coalition, it requires a 3/4 majority. But Theresa May got that once in 2017. If she wanted it, she could get it again. Then there's the good old-fashioned way to prorogue Parliament, which is for the opposition, or for anyone, frankly, any 50% majority. It could come from anywhere in the House of Commons, voting against the government in terms of their confidence. And then third, if a Parliament lasts for 5 years, and even if there are no challenges, it's automatically prorogued.
Yep, although the tectonic plates are beginning to shift. As you rightly said, if the new centrist bloc were to vote with the opposition, it is possible that a majority for a no-confidence motion could be carried. The problem with that is that the independent group have already signalled that they would not be so in favour of that. And that's very odd, because it's part of their thesis that Corbyn is a loser. Corbyn could not win an election. In which case, what's wrong with
proving
having one?
Indeed.
Tony X, a very, very powerful point he makes here. How long before Western, quote-unquote, civilization becomes nothing more than a footnote in Eurasian history books? Just before you answer, of course, Mr. Gandhi famously said when asked by an American journalist, what do you think of Western civilization? He reflected for a moment and then answered, I think that would be a good idea. Of course, the Eurasian history book is being written now, but it's amazing how ignorant some people are. For example, I do a nightly show on RT America, and I was asked about Mr. Trump bullying European countries to get them to stop taking Russian gas, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is already well underway and by the end of the year will be pumping gas. And I made the point that all around me were amazed by Moscow is the biggest city in Europe. Russia is the biggest country in Europe. The Russian economy dwarfs the great majority of European economies. The idea that you can other Russia, expel it somehow from the European continent, is one of the problems we face since the end of the Second World War, don't you think?
Well, I suppose one could say the same thing about Turkey, because geographically, even more so than Turkey, quite obviously, Russia has a Pacific coast. It shares a border with North Korea, with China. It also shares a border with Finland and with Estonia. And so you could really call it what you would like. And I suppose since traditionally the capitals of Russia have been St. Petersburg, which is a consciously European city, literally in the way it was conceived, and Moscow, which is kind of a European city, Russia can really be a chameleon. But that means that in some respects, Russia can choose its own identity. In others, it means other people can choose it for it. I personally think Russia's too big for one capital city. I think it should have at least 3, and at minimum 2, with Vladivostok on the Pacific being, frankly, a much more important long-term city for Russia to develop than Moscow or St. Petersburg.
It has 7 time zones, doesn't it, Russia?
Somewhere around there, yes. Yeah. I think it is 7 indeed.
Now, Bewley is on the line from Lincoln. Let's hear from him. Bewley, welcome to the show.
Oh, hello, George.
Hi.
Thanks for having me on.
Welcome.
Oh, yes, I've got a few interesting points about global warming.
Oh, yes.
Now, because of course they change the titles. It's now climate change, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is
agnostic.
Yeah. This is transcribed from Professor Don Easterbrook, Emeritus Professor of Geology of Western Washington University. And what he said is 2 points I'll bring out. One, there isn't enough CO2 in the atmosphere to initiate global warming. It's minuscule. In fact, it's 0.04%, which in layman's terms is if there's 100 molecules of air, there's only 4 molecules of CO2. So it's minuscule. And since the 1950s, CO2 has increased by, this is emissions, 0.08%. That's 1/1000th of a percent. And that's emissions. So it's so small, he's saying it can't affect warming. And the second thing he said was it lags after global warming. So you'd expect it to come before, like a precursor, before warming occurs. But it comes afterwards, so it's released. So there are 2 points there that he has brought out, saying that it can't be CO2 that's causing global warming.
Well, look, I'll tell you what, Bewley. I've just made a note, and my friends have taken it. We're going to get this Professor Easterbrook on the show next week. So stay tuned, and we'll put these points to him and to other experts. Thanks a lot for that call. Amsel says, ask Adam, could you explain Corbyn's customs union suggestion?
Well,
You're a better man than me if you can.
Well, it's a very funny thing. I talked about Turkey in the previous conversation. Turkey has a relationship with the EU customs union, which is an incomplete one. There are certain goods that are restricted in terms of otherwise frictionless trade between non-EU member Turkey and the rest of the EU, 28 for now, 27 possibly next week. Corbyn's position is that he doesn't want to be in the European Customs Union, let alone the European Customs Union with restrictions, which is what Turkey has, but he wants to be in a customs union, meaning a new one with the EU. There's only one problem. When you're fully in that customs union, it means you have to have a common tariff policy. Unless something so out of this world, bespoke and unique is negotiated, being in a customs union versus the customs union would still mean that Britain would have to have EU tariff rules, meaning if a British Prime Minister wanted to conduct an FTA, a free trade agreement, with the ASEAN bloc of nations, with China, with Mozambique, with the United States, it couldn't happen because there's a common tariff circle that totally circles round all the member states of the or a customs union. So we're getting into the territory a bit like where Bill Clinton literally said that depends on what is when asked about his below-desk relationship with an intern who entered infamy shortly thereafter.
Here's John in Gravesend. John.
A very good evening to you.
Evening to you.
I'm very for pro-Russian trade. I watch the trade news avidly. I see Germany increasing trade with Russia. Even Ukraine, believe it or not, is increasing trade with Russia.
Yes.
Russia is the largest wheat producer in the world.
Yes.
I could list the things.
We're sanctioning Russia because of the Ukraine, and the Ukraine is increasing its trade with Russia.
Yes.
Go figure.
And also, what worries me is, as a Brexiteer, is if leaving Europe means I become the 51st state of America, that horrifies me. I mean, the thing is, Britain is slugging off every country for which it should be trading to create wealth. And we're doing it on behalf of the Americans, and other countries in Europe are trading with Russia. I've sent this all to my MP. I discussed before with you about the fourth and fifth biggest car manufacturers are Western, the 640 McDonald's restaurants in Russia. People are investing in Russia, and that we are, like Private Pike, slugging Russia needlessly. Our old wartime allies, dare I say.
It is extraordinary. Good points there, John. Here's a good one. Ali in Southwark. This gentleman you have, Adam, is like a rocket scientist and a great orator. He reminds me of someone. He's like a junior version of someone. Which brings me to my question. Is there something you're not telling us, George? Where were you exactly 32 years ago?
Entering Parliament at the expense of Roy Jenkins, I believe.
That's exactly what I was going to say. 32 years ago, I was dumping the leader of the last breakaway, Roy Jenkins, on his well-upholstered posterior outside a count in Glasgow. No, Ali, actually Adam has a very much more exotic background than me, but I'll leave him to tell you that background. But we are not father and son, though I have adopted him, as you can tell. Can Adam tell everyone why he thinks Theresa May's geopolitical judgment is so lousy? She seems to align herself to countries that have no future in a world that's sick of wars. It's a good point, that.
Because she likes familiar company. That's one way to put it. But I think, as Ken Clarke, no Brexiteer himself, far from it, put it at the time that she was elected leader, that she doesn't know much about foreign affairs. And if you're trying to turn the EU into something foreign rather than something fraternal, you bloody well better know about foreign affairs. And that's the problem. Theresa May at heart is a technocrat. She's not a great platform speaker like Gladstone. She's not a great ideologue like Tony Benn. She's not even a particularly good manipulator like Tony Blair. She's a technocrat. She's the most famous civil servant in the world, but she's dealing with a gang of less notable but very much more experienced civil servants when it comes to these cloak and dagger negotiations. If someone came in saying, I'm going to approach this from the perspective of foreign policy, from realistic and pragmatic economic sense, and from the position of a treaty maker, then Britain might be getting somewhere.
Now, here's one from Chris Morningstar. Adam, what do you believe is the best way a truly left-wing US Democrat can win in 2020? And who do you believe can achieve it? And how can they negotiate the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, to achieve it? Now, you describe yourself as a centrist.
Yeah, a true centrist.
A true centrist.
Not a liberal.
Not a liberal. You're very far from being a liberal. But you're not truly left-wing in the way that Chris Morningstar and me are. So let's kind of reframe that question. Of all the runners and riders so far in the US presidential race, who has most captured your attention?
My attention, it's someone called Andrew Yang, who's not polling very high because most people haven't heard of him, but he was just on the Joe Rogan podcast, which is huge in the United States, and I think he's very interesting. You can't call him right-wing, you can't call him Bernie Sanders-style left-wing, you couldn't even call him George McGovern left-wing for those who remember Nixon's opponent in 1972, but he's someone that seems to be almost Singaporean in his sense of government intervention when needed, a robust private sector when possible. And that's interesting. The second interesting thing about him is he's talking about that which no one in any Western so-called democracy is talking about, and that's that the threat to jobs isn't trade, the threat to jobs isn't immigrants, the threat to jobs is, cue the spooky music, the rise of the machines, but quite literally automation that crept into heavy industry over the last 40 years is rapidly creeping into the service sector, the retail sector. And this is a man who's went with truckers, driven across the plains of the United States and said to them, aren't you worried that the government doesn't have a plan for when your job might be phased out inevitably by a robot? And he's winning hearts and minds because unlike the other Democrats, at least unlike most of them, he said, I know why Trump won. He plugged into the fear that people losing their living standards, having their jobs threatened, having their wages threatened. He tapped into that. Only, in Yang's opinion, Trump had the wrong solutions. And certainly insofar as 19th century protectionism is one of Trump's solutions, I agree that he's got that very wrong.
Yang, Y-E-N-G.
Y-A-N-G, that's right.
Y-A-N-G, for those that want to look him up. You seem to have a particular antipathy towards Tulsi Gabbard. Please explain what's wrong with her, because her anti-war message is resonating with a lot of people in the United States and beyond.
It's simply for one reason. I don't like some people who oppose war and oppose extremism in one theatre of conflict and cheer it on in another. Her relationship to the extremely extreme BJP government in India is frankly even more worrying than if Trump had all too close relations with the Russian government. And I say that for one reason only. The Russian government, for all its faults, and I've named many over the years, sectarianism at home and promoting sectarianism abroad isn't one of its faults. It is India's fault in terms of this BJP government. And she is so closely intertwined with these people and with Modi himself that I just couldn't stomach anyone who would, by her associations and by her open loyalties, couldn't understand that the Kashmir human rights disaster can only be solved through dialogue and de-escalation. You can't have someone who views that as an impossible position to be in the White House.
Here's Lizzie. a prodigious correspondent, a very clever one. Ask Adam, didn't China buy all a certain African country's lumber a year or so ago, turned the country into a desert almost overnight?
Well, China's actually less involved in buying commodities than it is involved in industry. China's big thing, contrary to the popular myth, isn't somehow draining foreign countries of their natural resources, but about building up their industry so that one day they can become a co-equal trading partner with China, and so that furthermore their citizens working in gradually industrializing economies can better afford Chinese goods. Again, automation is going to make it so that the numbers in terms of jobs needed in the agricultural commodities sector are going to be less important, whilst likewise synthetics, sustainable ones at that, things like solar energy, which China is bringing into Africa in a huge way, is actually going to preserve Africa's natural environment into the future.
Now, just en passant, you like China very much. You don't like the Russian government very much.
Correct.
Tell us why.
Because the Russian government doesn't know anything about basic economics. And for a country as big and as powerful as Russia, with an educated population, it really had no excuse not to do in the 1980s what China did in the 1980s. In the late 1970s, the poverty rate in China was 88% of the entire population. That's a lot of people. Today, it's less than 2%. In a year's time, it's expected to fall to naught. In Russia, in the late 1970s, you had an advanced, heavily industrialized economy with no poverty, with no homelessness, and instead they destroyed their own economy. And that's why I say, and I've actually written a piece about this, the problem with Russia isn't a lack of free speech, but a lack of free markets. And when I say free markets, I'm not talking like Thatcher in the 80s. I'm talking about the free markets of China, market socialism, the free markets of Singapore, the kinds of things that Mahathir Mohamad developed in Malaysia, markets where the private and public can exist harmoniously. Russia, frankly, is still, in an economic sense, run by a group of bandits. The only difference is, unlike in the 90s, they mostly play ball with the government, where in the 90s they actually pulled the strings of the government in a naked, open sense.
Christina says, does Adam think America could start World War III? What does Adam see as the greatest threat to world peace?
I think the greatest threat to world peace is the proliferation of non-state terrorism, the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the hands of rogue states, and number 3, narcotics. Because what's fairly infrequently mentioned is that while not all people on heavy narcotics are terrorists, just about every terrorist, religious so-called terrorists, secular terrorists, and everything in between are on some form of drug. Look up the drug Captagon, the radical terrorist drug of choice in the 21st century. So those are the 3 great evils in my view.
Now it's up to you to let the debate begin. If you think George Galloway
on Talk Radio.
Now, you thought I was clever. Wait till you hear the clever eggs that are coming in here into the studio in a moment or two. We have Phil Dobbie, economics journalist and podcaster supreme. I follow him. I'm actually one of his Patreon sponsors because he and Steve Keen are one of the great double acts of world economics. And we've got Adam Gary, the cleverest man in England, who just celebrated his 32nd birthday, but sounds like he's so wise that he could be 92. In fact, he could have been from 1892. He's like a statesman from another age. We're talking Bismarck here. That's the level of the education and brilliance of Adam Gary. You can ask Adam, hashtag Ask Adam, anything at all you like. And by the way, I mean anything, because Adam Gary knows as much about the monkeys as he knows about the monkeys that are running things on the international political scene. He is literally the cleverest man in England. Phil Dobbie is coming in to talk about our economic situation. Let me tell you, I think Theresa May is going to come back with a deal next week, and that some of this will be otiose. I think that Theresa May and the EU have done a deal on the basis that it's not in the EU's interest for us to leave without a deal. And it's not in Theresa May's interest, if she wants to keep her party together, of leaving without a deal. So I feel that next week some form of words will be arrived at. After all, that's all we're talking about here. We're talking about words. A form of words that doesn't include the words Irish backstop will be agreed, I think. But if it isn't, then in only a little over 30 days, we leave the European Union on WTO terms. How many times have you heard that said? But nobody ever explains what that means. Nobody actually knows what that means. We have been trying for weeks to get the WTO onto the show, onto the University of the Airwaves, so they could explain it to us. Finally, they got back and said they didn't have anyone that could talk to us on the radio. I find that a little bit surprising, even a little bit suspicious. But anyway, we'll soon be in the world of WTO, IMF, World Bank, and all the rest of it. And if we've any sense, we'll be looking beyond them and past them. We'll be looking east, where the sun always rises. I'm going to be talking to Adam Gary about Asian markets, about the Asian Development Bank, about the future that Britain can have trading with and getting investment from the Far East, because Adam, as the head of Eurasia Future, is a considerable expert on that. So, you need to call me, 0344 499 1000, or write to me on the various platforms I have adumbrated. Ella has sent an SMS. George, I've supported Corbyn since the beginning. I voted to leave the EU because of Article 106. If Corbyn drags us back, I'll feel betrayed. Well, if Corbyn drags you back, Ella, you will have been betrayed. Tony X, the protest board, one of the masters in this open university, says the fundamental problem with a broad church is that you need a lot of columns to hold it up. Very good. Tony goes on, to be fair, George, you, I, and a million others saw the split coming from the day Corbyn was elected leader. And David Woolnough says the PLP has been a problem ever since Corbyn was elected twice as our leader. We, members and voters, need a team in Parliament who represent food bank users, the poor, the exploited of this country. MPs who don't agree should go, and go quickly.
Talk Radio. Contact Talk Radio. Call 0344.
Now, as I said, Phil Dobbie is an economic journalist, but that's a bit like saying Ronaldo is a footballer. Phil Dobbie is one of the brains of Britain, and he's not even British. If I'm right?
Well, I am. I lived in...
You spent a long time in Australia.
Long time in Australia.
It was that can of Foster's in your hand that threw me.
Do you know, they don't. It's the only thing they don't do is they don't drink Foster's. We drink Foster's over here. No one would drink Foster's because it's...
is that right?
Oh, it's such a...
I wouldn't know, actually. But
such an awful beer, isn't it? I mean, who would want to drink Foster's?
An interesting segue off the point. Phil, if I'm wrong and Theresa May doesn't get a deal next week...
Yeah,
we're into uncharted waters. We're into Britain afloat, some would say adrift in the world, reliant on WTO terms to trade with our former partners in the EU and indeed the rest of the world. Kindly tell us what that means.
It means, well, first of all, I don't share your confidence there's going to be a deal done next week, but I also don't.
Almost nobody does, but we'll see if I'm right.
I also don't think that we're going to leave at the end of March. I think it almost certainly. I mean, certainly if you look at the markets, I will answer your question in a second, but certainly if you look at the markets and the way the pound is priced at the moment, that would seem to indicate that most people who deal with money don't believe it's going to happen at the end of March either. That it's somehow going to be pushed back, and obviously there's this vain hope that there'll be some sort of way out of it, and
something will turn up.
Something will turn up. It's like, who knows what? I mean, it is a bizarre time that we are in right now, isn't it? But the World Trade Organization rules are, I mean, Google it and have a look. It's a complex set of tariffs that are almost like the default, down to a granular level. Just as if you're dealing with the EU and you look at their sets of tariffs down to the granular level, they are incredibly complex as well. But the thing with WTO rules is they hardly apply to anybody because, of course, everybody has formed their own deals between their own countries.
Trade deals
and moved away from those WTO rules. So, so it's almost
They're
like
a default position.
A default position that is a transitory phase, and we'll move away from them just as soon as we can get deals. I don't think we're going to get very good deals, by the way, because if you look at Japan, for example, I mean, the response from Japan, who's just signed a free trade deal for the EU, doesn't kick in for a couple of years, but I mean, the Japan response was, well, obviously the deal that we're going to give to Britain isn't going to be as good as the deal that we're going to give to the EU because, they're smaller, they've got less negotiating power. And we're going to hit that time and time again, aren't we? But the bigger issue, I think, is not the tariffs from the WTO. I mean, obviously, the big issue is the tariffs we are going to face with the EU, our neighbour, some of which are, will penalise us a great deal. For example, in agriculture. So that's going to be our biggest issue. By default, we're going to go to the WTO rules. We're going to want to try and sign trade deals. The biggest trade deal we obviously need to sort out is not, strangely enough, is not New Zealand or Australia or the Faroe Islands. The biggest trade deal we need to sort out is with the EU because that is where 50% of our trade goes. And then there's all the other countries that we're trading with now through an agreement that we've got through the EU, which is another 11 or 12%. So to try and gain back that 60 or 70% of trade, we've got to sign all these trade deals that get us really back to the starting position. And that's going to, given that we can't even get a transitory agreement sorted out with the EU, after 2.5 years, how long is it going to take us to sort all that lot out?
Now, let's see what this all means at a granular level. So I want to sell you Phil Dobby ink in France, a bushel, and you want to sell me a Citroen car.
Yeah.
What kind of tariffs are we talking about here? And can't we have a reciprocal agreement with France that your Citroen cars can enter here freely, and you need to let our bushels enter France freely?
Well, not with France, because not without the whole of the EU. Obviously, we can't have a single trade agreement with a single country within the EU. We've got to have an agreement with the whole of the EU, which means we've got to have an agreement which is satisfying all 27 remaining members of the EU. So it's not that straightforward, is it?
No, sorry, I misspoke. But of course that's true. But the EU sells us a lot more than we sell them. You say 50% of our trade is with them, but we have a very considerable trade imbalance with them.
Yeah.
We are net importers of EU goods and services to a very remarkable degree. In fact, if you were to strip out financial services, the imbalance on manufacturers and on agricultural products would be very, very considerable, wouldn't it?
It's because Germany makes stuff and we don't, by and large.
Wasn't that the plan?
Well, I mean, I
they would do the manufacturing, France would do the agriculture, we'd do the money.
Yeah, well, maybe that would. Do you think it was as simple as that?
I think that was the plan. Yeah.
Well, okay. Well, there we are. Now we're saying, well, we don't want to do that. We want to do all of it ourselves.
Yeah.
Which means that with any change, whether you're for or against Brexit, you're going to have to accept that we're going through a big transition. There's going to have to be an awful lot of change. Deals are going to have to be done, and sure enough, we'll go through. I mean, it doesn't really matter what those WTO rules are, and they are many and varied. The fact is, we'll want to move away from them as quick as possible and form deals and partnerships which are going to be to our advantage. But I think the point is, it's going to take years to get to that stage, and the biggest obstacle we face is trying to reach that agreement with our nearest trading partner. See, what gets me on the whole thing about Brexit is that everyone looks at the the deal that's been done and is talking as though that's the final deal, and it's not. It's just the transitional deal. I mean, the actual deal itself that we are walking blindly into is like, what was it, 17 pages, I think, of platitudes that we
just words.
we will endeavour to, and all that sort of stuff, without actually any legal binding whatsoever. That's my biggest concern, that we're walking into this saying, well, we don't know what that trade arrangement is going to be, and in the meantime, we're in this temporary arrangement. And that's why I'm not so sure that there's going to be any deal done that's going to satisfy people, because you're going into something that's going to be a transitory arrangement that we're going to be stuck with possibly forever.
But you do take my point that it's not just that the British have an incentive to reach a deal. The Europeans also do.
Yeah, because of that trade imbalance, but they are much bigger than we are, and so whereas 50% of our trade,
although they're not doing that well, Phil.
No, well, no. I mean, Germany is...
Germany may be in recession. Italy is in recession.
Yeah.
France is on the brink of recession.
Well, Germany is as close to being in recession without technically being in a recession. And they had so the technical definition of a recession is 2 quarters where you have a negative growth. Your GDP declines. They had one of minus 0.1, and then the next one was 0.00. So allow for rounding error.
If it looks like, quacks like, walks like.
And then, and look, I mean, there's...
our growth rate is very poor, 1.4, but it's
better than
than Germany and France.
Yeah.
It's worse than the US and Canada, but it's better than Germany and France. So I suppose the point I'm making is these European partners, it's not as if they're having a wonderful time and can afford to slam the door on Britain as it leaves the party.
No, I mean, you're right that it has to go both ways. The danger is, though, to say that that argument's been used a lot, hasn't it? Right from the very beginning. And look, you and I think, have different attitudes. You and I get on so well, but we have different attitudes on Europe. In that, I think, we should stay in there. I think the euro is the big problem. Mm-hmm. We definitely, what a sensible thing.
We did the right thing.
We absolutely.
Well, thanks to Gordon Brown, because Tony Blair would have taken us into the euro in a heartbeat.
And that would have been a tragic mistake. But just on the size of things, I mean, they are a bigger country. So whereas 50% of our trade is at risk, a lot of the countries, it might be 4 or 5% or 10 or 11%. Or, I'm not sure what it is, our trade with Germany, the trade balance with Germany, but I think it's somewhere in the order of 10 to 15%. So it's so that would hurt them. But it's not 50% of the economy at risk.
Of course not. But it's high value stuff. I mean, we both, I'm sure, quite like their motor cars. We like their sound systems. Yeah. We buy a lot of high value things from them.
But it's also less price elastic stuff. So an extra 10% added to the value of a car that we might buy from Germany, we might go, oh, that's a bit unfortunate. But an extra 10% added to the value of farm produce, for example, that might be sending to France, could kill the farm industry. So you've got to look at that as well.
Yeah, sure, I take that point. But we will need to become more self-sufficient. We will need to grow. It's not that we need Roquefort cheese. We might like it, but we don't need it. We have our own cheese.
You're going to have to adjust your whole lifestyle, aren't you? I can tell. He's got a little cheese plate beside him.
I'm old enough, and you are too, to remember that we once were something. Before we joined the European Union, we were not nothing. Yeah. We were actually quite a significant country. It troubles me always that people imagine that without the European Union we'd be living in the forest painting our faces blue. We can grow, we can build, make,
but
and
time,
so on. It will take time, yes.
It would take time, and also, the idea that we can reindustrialize. I think we're getting to the stage where we're at the end of the industrial age, and we've the next age, which could be to our benefit. Obviously, is the digital age.
We're quite good at digital.
So look at us. You're listening to us on a digital radio.
And wonderful it is. And the fit just up the road at the Circle. In East London, there's a fintech industry which is the envy of the world. There's our cultural power and marketability is very considerable. Yeah. Before we joined the European Union, London was the cultural capital of the world. It could be again.
Yeah, and it could well be. I'd argue that it still is, really, and I don't think Europe has changed that in any way. All it means, all it perhaps means.
Who's listening to Kraftwerk?
Well, I don't know. Probably someone is. Someone who's not listening to you, sitting alone in a dark room. Well, obviously not many, George. But the problem with all of it, and you're right, but the question is, how do we transition to that? And that's what really concerns me. And look, this isn't a mistake economists make. Economists get criticised for thinking that you can, change something and instantly people retrain themselves and move to new industries. We saw it with Margaret Thatcher, for example, that in the northeast of England, you could move from being a shipbuilder to doing something in the digital arts or, whatever. You would reinvent yourself somehow miraculously, and you can't. Some of this stuff takes a generation. And so what we're doing is an extreme change to the way the country operates, and we're doing it in 2.5 years. Well, we're not doing it in 2.5 years.
No,
we're doing it in a month now.
Well, not even. I think it's, to be precise, something like 980 hours from now.
All right, and counting.
So by the end of no, it won't be. I like a bit of transition. I'm, I have no need of most of the things that I consume in my life. I'm ready to forego them for the purposes of making a new future for the country.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not as if
people say that though, but when push comes to shove, it depends how big the change is, doesn't it? As you say, a smaller selection of cheese we can possibly cope with. That's easy because we make lots of cheese in the UK and it's bloody good cheese. But there might be other things that we're not prepared. The fresh produce that we're getting from Europe, for example.
Well, but of course, a lot of fresh produce
is coming from other parts of the world.
Out of the European Union. There are all kinds of third world, global south economies that are effectively locked out by tariff barriers from the EU, and we can actually make a new future in that. Look, we could talk all night about this, and of course there's a big political question on whether there's going to be a deal or not. Do you see any significance in the WTO refusing for weeks now to come on the radio show and talk about this? Are they afraid of the way in which they're going to be thrust centre stage?
I think they probably see themselves as a neutral body, and they see this as being a heated debate. And then they look at the reputation of George Galloway and they go, my God, that's the very epicenter of all of this. Why would we want to throw ourselves into that
into the lion's den?
So, but look, do you know what I think? So I think that's the answer. I mean, it's they see themselves as the neutral trade body. I mean, how long they're going to be around for is going to be interesting because, of course, Donald Trump's not a big fan of the World Trade Organization either. I'm not sure what we'd do without them. Everyone would just default to. I don't know. It would be the Wild West, wouldn't it? Without any sort of trade body to control agreements. But I mean, in a way, it's an administrative body, isn't it? It's like saying, well, okay, how do we? I mean, in the ideal world, you'd say, well, we shouldn't have any trade barriers.
Well, doesn't capitalism believe in free trade?
Yeah, it's a dangerous thing, though, isn't it? I mean, if it's
I'm not myself a fan of free trade.
I think there needs to be an element. Yeah. I mean,
their ideology rests on.
I know, but it doesn't exist, does it? I mean, there's no such thing as free trade anywhere in the world. There's always an element of protectionism anywhere. Look, I think the answer on the whole Brexit thing, and I've not heard this discussed anywhere, but in my mind, and it might be hard for the staunch Brexiteers to take, but I think we've spent so much time looking at this transition agreement. And deciding that we can't reach a solution on it. We have all the discussion about the backstop and whether we need it or not. And the answer is we only need it until we have a deal that requires it not to be there anymore. So why don't we just say, well, look, the trade agreement's going to take another 2 years. Let's forget about the transition period. Let's almost start again. Let's develop that final trade agreement. Let's just keep things as they are. Let's take part in these European elections. Let's stay good Europeans for 2 years until we reach what we believe is going to be the final trade deal. Then you don't need any transition agreement. You just move from where we are now to the trade deal. I don't know why we didn't. And I think when we started the whole thing, That was the idea, wasn't it? It was going to take
certainly
2.5 years, and we wouldn't leave we wouldn't need a transition deal. Maybe we have a transition deal just in case, but meanwhile we'd be working on the final deal. But we just stuffed around for so long. So why don't we say, well, okay, let's get someone else in who can move things along a little faster, and from either side of politics or from all sides of politics, and let's get that final trade deal sorted out. Then we don't need to worry about World Trade Organization rules.
And then Nigel Farage will be re-elected to the European Parliament. I'm sure
he'd love that.
He'd
Absolutely.
be a taker for that.
Well, that's not too important because he hardly ever shows up, so he can't be too much of a detractor, can he? So, anyway, I don't know. I just feel like that could be the way forward.
It's common sense, Phil, which is what we've come to expect from you. Now, you and Steve are busy all the time. I mean, I listen to your discussions. Absolutely riveted.
This is Steve Keane you're talking about for those.
Yeah, Steve Keane.
He's a far more brilliant mind than I am.
Well, no, but you're a great double act, a really great double act. How do people follow you?
Well, by the way, good news on this, that we, this last week, started writing a book together.
Okay.
So, mind you, it's going to be about 20 chapters long, and we've written one of them so far. So another 19 to go. So the aim is to get it out before the end of the year. But I mean, really enjoying writing that because.
What's it going to be called?
Well, I don't know yet. Well, we've got a working title, but I don't want to give it away because we might come up with something much better. I might tell you now, and people go, "That's a crap title." So
no, we don't want that.
So we'll wait until we've got a better one. But yeah, if you want to hear us, we do. Well, Steve's got a site on Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keane, I
spend a lot of money on him.
Yeah, I know you do. Yeah, no, I see. I see you on the.
And it's worth it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's great stuff. And some of his discussions with you on there have been great.
Well,
half an hour. You?
The main stuff I do is with Steve, and I do a podcast for the National Australia Bank, which still got the Australian connection. Like, I've got a website, phildobby.com, so all the stuff that I'm doing is there. I'm thinking, actually, I used to do a podcast years ago. I'm thinking of starting that again as well, which is just me.
Good idea.
Talking.
This is the era.
It is, yeah.
I'm afraid to tell you, as the author of many books myself, podcasts go better than books.
Not this one. This is going to be a bestseller. We've told ourselves if we can get it into the bookshops of in airports, then we're doing all right.
Yeah,
and each
hardbacks in airports, they do well.
And each chapter, I mean, the idea is trying to explain some of the concepts that Steve has, which are quite complex, and I'll challenge him on some of them as well because I don't always agree with Steve. But to try and simplify it, put it into, which I think is my job in the stuff that I do with Steve. So that's the idea of this book, and then the idea is that each chapter can be read while you're sitting on the toilet. The length of a chapter will be, your wife will be complaining, but the idea is that that it's bite-sized chunks that you can consume, not necessarily sitting on the toilet. You could be having a cup of coffee or whatever, but easy to understand, digestible chunks.
I look forward to it. I look forward to reviewing it. Phil Dobby, economics journalist, podcaster. Thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows.
Always a pleasure.
Now it's up to you to let the debate begin. If you think George Galloway is playing...
It's the mother of all talk shows. It's the Open University of the Airwaves. Here's Paul from North Wales on the line. Paul, welcome.
Hi, George. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Been a good show tonight, I think.
Yeah, indeed. I have to say, I'm pretty depressed by what's going on because it seems to me, particularly with the Labour splitters, is that a number of people have been seeking to undermine Jeremy Corbyn at every possible angle.
Including his deputy leader and including his shadow chancellor. I've just read the article, the interview with John McDonnell in the Evening Standard this evening, which is headlined, Luciana Berger was let down by Labour.
Well,
not that she let Labour down.
No.
But she was let down by Labour.
Yeah. Anti-Semitism is terrible and unforgivable and should be tackled. And I suspect Luciana Berger has had quite a bit of quite unjustified personal abuse.
Totally. The question is whether it was from members of the Labour Party.
Absolutely. And as an MP, I recall a few years back she was one of the few that stood up and challenged the status quo with regard to the child abuse scandal. But the greatest crime, it seems to me, that Jeremy Corbyn has committed is to stand fully square on with the Palestinian people who have had their land stolen from them. They continue to have their land stolen from them. We effectively have it's close to apartheid in that area with the largest prison camp in the world, and somebody has to stand up, and it's not anti-Semitic. It's got nothing to do with anti-Semitism, to say that's just wrong.
Well, I do, of course, say so on all my many platforms, and I shall never cease to do so. And I think you're right that Corbyn's, not his only, but his biggest problem is that he has spent the last 40 years supporting the Palestinian cause. I'm not in any doubt at all about that. Thanks, Paul. Time is running, so I need to press on. Here's Andy in Perth. Go ahead, Andy.
How are you tonight, George?
I'm good. Fighting fit.
Good man. I'll be as quick as I can. There's a couple of things I want to cover. Do you think if Blair had been jailed, like he should have been, in my opinion, and many's, I'm sure you agree with that, this split in the party, Labour Party, would be happening?
Well, I do think that Labour has been extraordinarily remiss in not using the Chilcot inquiry report, which, after all, took millions of pounds and many years to bring forth its conclusions, to make a clean break with Tony Blair. Not least because Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party when the report was delivered. He should have said then, in absolutely unequivocal terms, that Labour was turning the page, was opening a new chapter, and that Blair and his lieutenants, Campbell and Mandelson and all the others, were no longer a part of his future. Their future lay elsewhere, and the Labour Party was going to become, dare I say it, new.
Yeah, I mean, I think they should all have been jailed. I mean, I can't see the people that are splitting away wanting to be associated with convicted war criminals, you know, if that had happened. But
well, of course, the possibility still exists for trials in the future, and that's a matter for the law. But what was a matter for Labour was whether or not that Tony Blair should continue to be a member of the Labour Party.
Yeah, it's a disgrace, really, isn't it? I mean, do you think, I think we talked before, if there had been a written constitution, if Corbyn was in power, he'd support a written constitution, and if there had been, do you think that would have made a difference?
Well, I can't answer for him, but I think having a written constitution is a precondition for a modern state. And if we had a modern constitution, it would stop governments from committing crimes because the Supreme Court would be able to intervene where a government was acting out with the Constitution. So, I do actually think so, Andy. Thanks very much for that call. The Red Resistance. Can Adam outline the significance of FDR's New Deal, what it did for the US economy, and how it was gradually rolled back, eventually paving way for Reaganomics?
Well, there were several parts to it. One was changing monetary regulation. That, I think, was a big failure because it disallowed US citizens to own gold for the first time in US history, which to me is unconstitutional in the context of that written US Constitution. Of course, it wouldn't be in Britain if someone did the same. There were other things that were very well-meaning, but which in terms of the statistics didn't work out as well as they might have done. The Works Progress Act and other things like that, where money was invested to create jobs. It did create jobs and kept people temporarily, at least, off the breadline. But what really got the US out of the economic rut that began in 1929 was the fact that after 1945, its biggest industrial competitors were either physically destroyed or withdrawn from the capitalist system, the Soviets and their friends, eventually China after 49. And because of that, America had its gold reserves intact. America had its factories that hadn't been bombed, all ready to switch over to the civilian production sector. That's what saved the United States. Now, you could do it without a war, but history at that time, it's all written, it was indeed the war that saved the US economy.
The Communicipalist says, I can't believe how so many Corbyn supporters cannot see how his future prospects relate to Brexit. Without it, Labour will never implement anything that could compensate for the massive hit on the working class and our grassroots communities by austerity. Fully agree with that. Bob Justice says, I don't consider the independent splinter group to be a life-threatening condition for the Labour movement. These people aren't exactly political heavyweights. As, for an example, Joan Ryan. Her biggest previous claim was her expenses. Media widely reported on them. As a matter of fact, the expenses of Joan Ryan, Luciana Berger, and Ian Austin are eye-watering to read. Literally eye-watering. Stretch Cause Armstrong says, great show, George. Can you ask your guest, will the USA ever allow the yuan to be the world currency, in turn controlling the financial markets?
Well, they'd, of course, never allow it. The question is, will they have a choice? After 2050, unless we're all living under a nuclear umbrella, meaning the little stick that's left of that umbrella, it's going to be a gradual but inevitable movement. People remember, or will remember, that the pound didn't go out of fashion as the global reserve currency until after Britain's economy was overwhelmingly subsumed by the United States. The difference with China is that China doesn't want its currency to be the reserve currency, but rather wants it to be an anchor to a basket of currencies. In fact, in 2008, the then governor of the People's Bank of China outlined that he wants to avoid what's called the Triffin problem, of when you have a domestic currency whose same units are used to try to make the world liquid by making it a reserve currency. China picked up on that problem that happened in the context of Bretton Woods. They want to avoid it by going to a basket of currencies. Maybe, just maybe, that will include a partly metallic standard. China's buying a lot of gold. You don't hear about it, but
so is Russia too.
Indeed.
Martin says, so the UK Labour is institutionally racist, yet it has MPs consisting of Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Hindu, Sikh and Muslim faiths, as well as people of Irish, Scottish, English, Welsh, Afro-Caribbean, Indian and other nationalities. Pull the other one. Well, let me just make a segue. The execrable Jess Phillips described me the other night as a racist. I have represented more people from the black and minority ethnic communities in Parliament than any MP in history. I have an Indonesian wife. I have 4 mixed race children. If the word racist can be tossed at me, I'm afraid that word no longer has any meaning at all. X-Ray Vision says, does Adam think the US will be able to keep up the 20th century style gangsterism that served them so well? Is the US over? China, Russia and others don't seem to be having any of it these days.
I'll give a very short answer to that. The answer is that it's not going to be over as soon as a lot of people on the gentleman's clear side of the spectrum thinks. But for those who keep in good health, and I would recommend to the gentleman to do so, he may well live long enough to see that come to fruition, but it isn't going to happen anytime soon.
So when Chairman Mao said the US was a paper tiger as long ago as the 1960s, that was patently ridiculous, because it's still a tiger now in 2019.
Well, a lot of important things are written on paper, including the useless US currency. But because we all agree on the value of that technically valueless currency, it's very valuable indeed.
Mal says, this week's politics remind me of the kids' programme Runaround of the 70s, hosted by the comedian Mike Reid, where kids had to choose between 3 answers and run onto a circle on the floor, and maybe jump ship onto another circle if they thought that the majority were actually on the right answer. Tony X says, ask Adam, single or double-breasted suits? You're a man that likes a waistcoat. What's your view on single or double-breasted?
I actually, if I had the time to peruse the clothing section, I actually prefer what's known as the Mao jacket, simply because I believe it's more utilitarian. The lapels on a traditional Western-style lounge suit are merely folded in. It becomes a singular object, and there's less accoutrements. I'm all about efficiency and utility.
George, the two-party system will do for these renegade losers and keep the likes of Farage out. That's why it's better than any proportional system. When exactly were the parties fit for purpose? From Still Hard Enough. That's come and have a go if you're still hard enough. No, I don't agree with that. Of course, the two-party system was reconfirmed in 2017 at the general election, but everything is about to change. If I'm telling you now, Mr. Still Hard Enough, and mark my words that I said it here, if Britain participates in the European Parliament elections this year by virtue of having extended Article 50, Nigel Farage will win the elections out the park. And Rick says, can you ask the history boy Adam Gary what the American progressives need to do to push their Green New Deal? Do you think a Sanders presidency could lead to a Corbyn-led government? Looking forward to the next History Boys programme on Patreon. Thanks, Rick.
Well, my personal view is that this Green New Deal is dead on arrival. It hasn't been well thought out. It's been rushed through. It puts radicalism over pragmatism. I'm all for greenness, but China's doing it while making people richer. This, I'm afraid, would make people poorer, particularly in industrial areas, where, incidentally, Donald Trump won because, using the wrong argument, he said he'd get the right result, more jobs. As to the second part of the question, I think Bernie's got a lot of life in him, but I think one of the problems with this Democratic primary is it's almost as if the list of people not running for president is shorter than the list of people who are. So I think a lot of the who's he and who's she's will have to fall by the wayside before we can have a proper conversation about what it takes and who's got it.
Now it's up to you to let the debate begin. If you think George Galloway...
Let's try and get through some calls now. Here's Tommy in County Tyrone. Tommy, welcome.
Good evening, George.
Evening to you, sir.
George, the second time I've got to talk to you now, so I'm feeling very privileged, you know.
It's a bad line, Tommy. We'll need to try and get back to you. Son. It's too difficult to hear you. Bob Justice says, regardless of Corbyn being on the Privy Council, I remember him not being privy to info last year. He's been in Parliament since 1983. Are people really meant to believe he's a threat to national security? Because if that's true, what kind of security is that? Brilliant. Here is the legend, Lizzie Fletcher, on the line from Gloucester. Go ahead, Lizzie.
Hi, George.
Hi.
How are you?
Yeah, good.
Oh, good. I wanted to just put one thing to you about Tinge or Tig. I think Tinge is more appropriate.
Yeah, funny, as in Funny Tinge Limited.
Yes. The independent new group of elite.
Yeah, very good.
I wanted to ask you what you know about and what you think of the fact that the day after they were formed, their account dropped off of Twitter at 1 o'clock in the morning, and at 4 o'clock in the morning it re-emerged with 70,000 followers.
Well, I suppose, it could be a conspiracy, but technically it could also be that a very large number of people quickly followed them and the whole thing collapsed. That is a possibility. I'm not surprised they've got 70,000 followers. I've got 306 or 7,000 myself.
Yes, but did you build them up in 3 hours?
No, I didn't. No, I didn't. But when you've got the kind of deluge of publicity that they've had, you'd probably be disappointed if you didn't have 70. Question is, how many votes have they got? And of course, they're determined not to show us that because they're determined not to stand for election.
That's right. That's right.
Are you worried? You're a Labour person, Liz. Are you worried that they will substantially damage the Labour vote and make a Corbyn government impossible?
With the help of the mainstream media propagandising their every move, of course. Everybody says to me, whether they're into politics or not, in fact, even more if they're not into politics, everybody hates Jeremy Corbyn. You know, these people have obviously, there's no smoke without fire. They've left the Labour Party for some reason, and it's because of Jeremy Corbyn. So, you know, all those people that just watch TV and just read the Sun newspaper, etc., are going to be full of that propaganda, aren't they? So, yes, it will. And I think it's all deliberately timed to coincide with, I think we'll have a general election this year, and I think the government will be forced into some kind of act which will culminate in a general election. And I think that they're now laying the ground for that to be a failure as much as they can for Jeremy Corbyn. But of course, don't forget the young people, you know, the people that couldn't vote and now they're 18 and they can vote. They're all Corbynistas and they all see the good that can come from his policies and his manifesto. I say his because it is about Corbyn, isn't it? Whether it is or not, you know, it's about the Labour Party, but Corbyn is the face of that. So I think that we might be very well surprised if we can get the young people to go and vote that have never voted before or because they weren't able to or didn't feel the need to. If we can get those young people out there, I think that the Tories and the rest of the establishment are in for a big shock.
Lizzie, thanks for the call. Tommy's back on the line from County Tyrone. Tommy.
Hi, George.
Yeah, that's better. Go ahead, sir.
Sorry about that. I live rurally, and BT just wouldn't be. I just wouldn't be on the top of their list.
Exactly.
George, listen. I have a few things I want to run past you. I won't take too long. Okay, I'll go as quick as I can. I've written them down because I'm not really a great speaker. Brexit should have triggered Article 50 straight away and left.
Definitely.
That's what we should have done. And I think that people that are fearing Brexit should be fearing the Tories more. Honestly.
I agree. Yeah, entirely.
The second thing I want to say, George, Corbyn. Second referendum will finish the possibility of a Labour government. Plus,
I agree with that also, yeah.
Plus, he's far too nice with Blair. He's far too nice with him. Okay?
Well, he's just nice, you see. He's a nice person.
I know that.
What we've got this evening.
We have to draw a line somewhere.
What we've got this evening is a man who is very far from nice, and whose history is rather dark, and I know it in every particular. John McDonnell, who's openly breaking with Corbyn this evening, both on the second vote and on the defectors. So there are signs that the Corbyn show is coming apart at the seams. Last point to you, Tommy, because I've got the legend that is Norma on the line.
The last thing I want to say, George, is that I want to commend you for what you've done on Sky News on Monday. You spoke the truth.
It's been very popular. I mean, I'm surprised because some people that I love very much and who are through the glass now imagined that I was somehow damaged or bruised or feeling some kind of despair. As a matter of fact, that Sky News interview I did has been the best thing since the last Sky News interview I did in 2006 during the Lebanon war. It's gone ballistic. It's already got 1 million views on social media and it's going to climb more and more, and I'm proud of everything I said in it.
George, but I think you should be getting more public support particularly from MPs for doing their job for them.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
I've done more to defend Jeremy Corbyn than any member of the Parliamentary Labour Party. Any.
George, one last thing. People, I'm sure a lot of people understand what I'm going to say here. Miami Shoban massacre.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
My goodness.
I'm sure any right man.
Do you remember my interview with Stephen Travers?
Absolutely.
It was one of the very best.
That's right. But George, that's out next month on Netflix.
Yes.
And I doubt very much that it's going to get very much MSM promotion. So I'm going to leave.
It definitely will from thee and me. It is a very, very important story indeed. I'm really sorry that I haven't been able to get to anything like all the callers or all the messages. We really value them. In any case, please call back next week. Here's the legend. That's Norma in Bristol.
Hello, George.
Hi, Norma.
I know there's not much time. This is a big deviation.
That's okay.
Okay.
As long as there's no hesitation or repetition.
Now, on your Twitter account last Monday, I did see that you...
Are you on Twitter? First of all, tell us, what is your Twitter handle? Because people ask me every week, can we not get Norma on Twitter?
Oh, well, I am, but I haven't got my name. I mean, I'm a bit of a coward, really.
Well, so what's your name on Twitter so everyone can follow you?
Well, you won't... Don't laugh. Fagash Flow.
Fagash Flow. It's totally brilliant. It's a wonderful name. You remember Andy Capp? You remember his wife?
Yeah, that's exactly. You want to see my picture?
Really?
Yeah, see the picture.
Andy Capp's wife was called Flo, and that's the picture of you I've got now in my mind.
No, it's Salima, the one who smoked cigarettes.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway,
she always had a cigarette on her list.
Time.
Go ahead.
Now, on the, I noticed that you enjoyed Anne Cleeve's The Crime Writers.
Totally brilliant. She was on Desert Island Discs.
That's the one.
As I was driving to Scotland at the weekend. Yeah.
But that is my husband's sister-in-law.
Oh, really? She's wonderful.
And
I mean, her books and the TV series that have been made out of them are brilliant. But her life story, as she told it, and the music she chose, was fantastic, Norma.
But the two parts of this quick conversation is her husband, who's my husband's brother, is worked for the RSPB, and you were talking about teaching your little lad about birds last week.
Yes.
Now, Tim, his brother, has written his British Birds book with a co-author, another man, and it's very good. And if you join the RSPB, you will get a free copy of my husband's brother's book.
Right, I'll do it tomorrow. RSPB, you've got a new member starting tomorrow. Norma, thank you so much. I'm sorry it's been so brief. Alan Ling says, what's your position on Scottish indie when we look around and see the god-awful mess Westminster has made in the UK? Don't you think Scotland would fare much better looking after her own affairs without Westminster holding us down? Enough is enough. Well, Alan, as I look at the SNP government in Scotland and its leaders and previous leaders, I'm not so sure where your confidence comes from. Simon Bartle says, Phil Dobby, an interesting man, following him now on Twitter, will also be listening to a podcast or two. That's what I like about Moats. You learn new things every week. You do, in fact. Red Fox says, bring back industry and manufacture. Let's rely on ourselves. Boycott products from Europe. They keep treating us badly with every deal we're trying to put forward. And my old and dear friend, Marie McFarlane, admonishes me thus: George, you can absolve yourself of the sin of not knowing that Kraftwerk were influenced by my British heroine, Delia Derbyshire, who set up the BBC Radiophonics Workshop by playing her Doctor Who theme. I'd never have forgiven myself, Marie, if I hadn't conveyed that to a grateful nation. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. And if it was, come back next week at the same time and the same place for the mother of all talk shows.